So let's talk a little bit more about the scientific method. Here is a rather simple schematic of how it proceeds. We start by kind of observing the world, observing behavior or other phenomena in the world going on around us. To that extent, it certainly helps to have kind of a curious mind as you proceed throughout your day. And certainly previous literature and theories and so forth help you observe behavior and other phenomena as well. The second part is you formulate a research question, something that's really interesting. It may start out with something like, I wonder if, blah, 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 right? So basically it's kind of applied wonder is the way I like to think about it when it comes to formulating a research question. The third part is to generate a testable prediction, or what we call a hypothesis, that addresses your question. So I think that if I change X, Y will happen. That would be an example of that. Then we collect and analyze data, and based on those data, we draw conclusions and use them to create or refine our theories. So that, in general, is kind of the five-step method of the scientific method, or the 5 steps of the scientific method, I should say. So step 1, I've covered these a little bit, but I'll briefly discuss them again. Informal observations of the world around you, as well as reading previous literature and so forth about some behavior or event tends to capture your attention. Then second, you formulate a research question. You identify factors or variables that are associated with your observation, and you use those variables to generate explanations for the behavior that you're interested in. In step 3, we tend to generate a hypothesis. So you figure out a way to answer it after that. A single hypothesis can lead to several different predictions, and the predictions generated from a hypothesis need to be testable, which we described in our last lecture. There has to be some way to test whether it's correct, your prediction, or not. Either observations will provide support for your hypothesis, or they will refute your hypothesis. That is, sort of disconfirm your hypothesis. But for a prediction to be testable, both outcomes must be possible. That is, it's not really a hypothesis unless it can either be confirmed or disconfirmed. So in that sense, we don't know the answer in advance. And in fact, if you know the answer in advance, it's not really research. Step 4, we collect and then analyze the data. So we evaluate our prediction using some kind of direct observation that we've done. Often it's an experiment or some other kind of research method. Our goal is then to provide a fair and unbiased test of our hypothesis. We want to really expose it to the light of day and observe whether the prediction is correct. The researcher must be careful to make sure to observe and record exactly what happens and not allow subjective interpretation to get in the way. A good research study will have safeguards in place to minimize the likelihood of bias, and we'll talk about what those safeguards are shortly. And then finally, we draw conclusions and create theories based on the results that we got. So we compare our actual observations to predictions made from the hypothesis, and we look at the extent that the observations agree with the predictions. Some agreement indicates that support for the original hypothesis exists and suggests mainly that you consider making new predictions and testing them. Once completed, researchers often circle back to step 2 or step 3, forming new hypotheses and then further exploring their theory. So how do we go about selecting the right participants for this? It's an important part of deciding what to research is really deciding what group you'll be studying. So in a perfect world, we would include every single person of the population that we're interested in. But of course we can't do that. For example, if you were a developmental psychologist and you specialized in infants, you can't go around and test every infant in the world, even though every infant in the world would be the population of interest. And instead, what you have to do is you have to sample. That is, you have to find a subset of all of those infants and be able to test them. And hopefully your subset is representative enough, that is, similar enough to the rest of the population, that you can make some generalizable kinds of claims about them. So here's the way it looks in a sort of graphic form. Research begins with a general question about the population, say infants. The population is this group right here, and then we sample from that population, and then the sample, the specific people that we end up testing, are here. The actual research study is conducted with that sample, again a subset of the total population, and then the results from the sample are generalized to the entire population. So because the sample is kind of a stand-in, right? They're used to make inferences or judgments about an entire population. They'd better reflect the entire population or be representative of that whole population. So one way to achieve this is by random sampling of participants. This ensures a representative sample. So every member of the population in a random sample has an equal chance of being selected to participate in the study. As a result, this avoids sampling bias in the research. The more representative the sample, the better the results will generalize or apply to the population of interest. So finding a random sample is really critical to being able to come up with good generalizable results. The problem is random sampling is not always possible either. Sometimes we just can't find a totally random sample and get a large enough population. Sometimes, as a result, psychological research and other types of research often uses samples of convenience, or groups of people who are easily accessible to the researcher. Now, usually in our conclusions and so forth in our research papers, we of course point out that it's a convenient sample, that it might not apply to the whole population. But the fact is, sometimes you have to get, instead of a random sample, more of a convenient sample. In fact, that's exactly what's happening in your psychology course or in your human systems engineering course, where you're signing up for experimental credits to learn how experiments work and also to provide data for the human systems engineering researchers. In that case, you and your fellow students are kind of a sample of convenience.